From the Gulf States newsroom, this is the Gulf States Gumbo, your weekly serving of stories from Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. I'm health equity reporter Drew Hawkins, and I'm actually going to be taking over the whole show this week to visit a story that happened 52 years ago this month. During a peaceful protest on the campus of Southern University in Baton Rouge, local law enforcement opened fire on a crowd of students.
So far, at least one person is dead in the violence at Southern University this morning.
And two students, Denver Smith and Leonard Brown, were shot and killed. This was in 1972, and it's one of the first instances of unarmed black men killed by police on camera.
You know, I took my arm and I pinched myself and I'm like, this is real.
That day is still just very, very vivid in my mind, and I never forgot it.
But it's a story that's mostly been lost to history. And now, what led up to the shooting, what happened that day, and what happened after are the focus of my new podcast called Bitter Jaguar. And I spent several years working with LSU's Cold Case Project to dig into this story. And today, we're going to hear a part of an episode of Bitter Jaguar. And to give you some quick context, what you're about to hear is just after the shooting. And we're getting into the investigations by the FBI and the state of Louisiana about what happened. Just after 12:30 on the afternoon of November 17, 1972, the phone rang in L. Patrick Gray's office in Washington, D.C. Gray was the acting FBI director at the time. On the other line was the Deputy Attorney General. He told him about the shooting at Southern the day before and ordered him to launch a civil rights investigation. The FBI quickly assembled a team led by William Sullivan, a hard-nosed investigator from the Philadelphia office, and they made a point to include black agents.
Here I am, a brand new agent, and I'm going out on a special assignment.
Ted Jackson was one of those black agents.
I mean, I haven't even been in 2 years, so you can understand probably the confusion I had, like, wow, me?
With a plan in place, they gave the special investigation a code name.
Batwo, I forgot that. Batwo was the code name.
Batwo. Sullivan and about 15 agents arrived in Baton Rouge 2 days after the shooting and set up shop in a hotel downtown. Pairs of agents handled different tasks. They took their work very seriously. As Ted Jackson remembers it, everyone was focused on the task at hand, especially their leader.
And it was fair. The investigation was fair. The Sullivan really wanted to get to the bottom of it.
Over the coming weeks, almost 40 FBI agents would work around the clock, interviewing eyewitnesses, public officials, and law enforcement. They'd review autopsies, conduct ballistics analysis, and question officers, trying to figure out what they knew and who wasn't telling the full story. At the same time, Louisiana's Attorney General, William Gust, was conducting his own investigation, preparing for a state grand jury trial that would decide what charges they would file and who they would file them against. Everyone knew the whole country was watching them, waiting to see if they would find the shooter and hold him accountable. Ted Jackson, a black agent from Cleveland, and his partner, a white agent from New York, spent most of their time on the road.
So we were all over Louisiana.
And being in the Deep South, Jackson said he expected to have to deal with racism from the locals, but it didn't take long for him to experience it firsthand while he was interviewing state troopers who were there at the time of the shooting.
I could see that they resented me because I had some tough questions.
What does that look like to you? Like, how do you see that?
Well, I knew, Louisiana, I knew. And it didn't bother me, and it didn't bother anybody else. But evidently somebody must have complained, and then Sullivan made the change.
Jackson and his partner were then assigned to interview Southern students. The two agents from the north found themselves in another world as they navigated rural Louisiana. Before GPS and with many of the country roads unpaved and difficult to identify, they often got lost. Sometimes they ended up in the wrong state.
So we pulled over, and the guy comes over, and we asked, "Where are we?" He said, "You're in Natchez, Mississippi."
While Jackson and his partner were traveling around the state conducting interviews, Jack Stoddard was one of the FBI agents assigned to meet with medical examiners. Based on the number of pellets removed from the bodies of Denver Smith and Doug Brown, the FBI determined that they were killed by a single blast. And all of the angles pointed to a cluster of sheriff's deputies positioned near the palm tree on the lawn in front of the administration building. There was also another important piece of evidence. 3 Baton Rouge TV news stations were there during the shooting, and the moment Smith and Brown were hit and fell to the ground was captured on camera. So it was possible the shooter himself would be seen there as well. Agents quickly got their hands on more than 1,000 feet of film and dozens of photos from the state police. They analyzed them frame by frame, but Stoddard said one key moment was missing.
And it seems like the video coverage cut off just before it panned to where we thought the shooters were.
So the moment the fatal shot was fired wasn't caught on camera, but other details helped the FBI narrow down the suspects. The single buckshot blast ruled out anybody who didn't have a shotgun. 24 deputies carried shotguns that day, but only 9 were near the palm tree. So in less than a week, the FBI had narrowed their list of suspects to 9 sheriff's deputies that were near the palm tree. The hunt was on to figure out which one of the 9 was the shooter. In interviews with the FBI, every deputy from the East Baton Rouge Parish Sheriff's Department denied firing the fatal shot and knowing anything about who did. So the FBI turned to an investigative tool that remains controversial even to this day. They asked each of the 9 deputies who carried shotguns and were near the palm tree to take a polygraph exam, or a lie detector test.
It was just a tool.
Ed Walker was an FBI agent from the New York office who was part of the Batwell investigation. He said polygraphs weren't perfect, but they could sometimes be helpful.
If somebody flunks a polygraph badly and the examiner is experienced and tells you, you can be pretty sure the guy is lying, but it's not, so it's a tool for you to use.
The deputies weren't required to submit to a polygraph, but 4 of the 9 potential suspects agreed right away and passed the test. Deputy Arthur Johnson, the only black deputy in the group of 9, was one of them. His wife, Joyce Johnson, remembers going with him downtown to meet with the FBI.
And we stayed down there all day. I mean, they questioned him all day.
Joyce said her husband never really talked about the shooting for the rest of his life, but she does remember how he felt about the polygraph exam.
I know it was rough. He did say that it was really rough. And they did tell him, because he asked them why they were questioning him, and they told him that the guys that did the shooting was on the side of him, so he didn't know if it was the left or right side.
So the FBI grilled Arthur Johnson about the men standing next to him. But the thing is, it's entirely possible that Johnson had no idea who those men were, not just because of the tear gas, but because at the time, black deputies and white deputies didn't really mix at all.
So I can't tell you that if there was any other deputies there. I wouldn't have known them anyway because they probably were white.
The 4 deputies who passed the lie detector test were ruled out as potential suspects, but that left the 5 who refused. By early 1973, the FBI had gathered as much evidence as it could, but without an eyewitness, an image of the shooter, or a confession, it was all circumstantial. And as the FBI was wrapping up, Louisiana's Attorney General was finishing his own investigation. They also determined that the fatal shot was a single blast that came from an area where 6 sheriff's deputies were positioned. But crucially, it stopped short of naming any of the suspects. They decided to compel the deputies to testify before a grand jury, where lying, also known as perjury, could be punished with prison time. Billy Batto was one of the 12 jurors on the grand jury for the Southern shooting. Prosecutors brought out witness after witness, 67 in total, forensic experts, deputies, and state police. Every deputy that testified told the grand jury they didn't fire the fatal shot and they didn't know who did. Batto said he remembers the suspects testifying before him.
The one I remember mostly was the deputy that said he didn't want to do the lie detector because he figured if he was eliminated from being a suspect, then that would put the onus on his buddies.
Batto said when he and the other jurors would talk about the testimony, they were all skeptical about the deputy who had refused the polygraph.
Yeah, we thought that he was not telling the truth.
Did you think that he was not telling the truth because he was protecting his fellow deputies or because he might have been the potential shooter?
Because he was protecting himself. That was my feeling. I don't know about the other jurors.
In July 1973, the state grand jury wrapped up its proceedings and pre-termitted the case without returning any indictments, essentially saying there wasn't enough evidence to indict anyone or enough to clear anyone. And unlike other cases where Batto served as a grand juror, with the Southern shooting, they didn't deliberate and return a decision as a jury.
I don't remember us ever voting because they didn't have a person for us to vote for or against. Not for or against, but is there enough evidence to send this man to trial? Well, there was no man to send to trial.
Since the Louisiana State Grand Jury chose not to indict anyone, that's been the whole story. If anyone has ever heard about the shooting at Southern University, the version they know probably goes something like this. 2 students were shot and killed by law enforcement, an investigation was done, and a grand jury returned no indictments. That's all we've known. We didn't know who the suspects were, we didn't know how the FBI investigated the shooting, and we didn't know what investigators believed might have happened, and who they thought was the most likely suspect. But it turns out there was another investigation, this one by the Department of Justice, and those documents tell a much clearer story. That was an excerpt of Bitter Jaguar, a new podcast that investigates the shooting of Denver Smith and Leonard Brown on Southern University's campus in 1972. To listen to the full series, look up Bitter Jaguar on WWNO's website or on Apple Podcast or Spotify. You can also find a link in the show notes. A special thanks to the LSU Cold Case Project, who investigated this story with me. This week's Gulf States Gumbo was produced by me, Drew Hawkins. Our theme music is by DJ Supreme. Special thanks to our partner stations, WBHM, Mississippi Public Broadcasting, WWNO, and WRKF. You can find the Gulf States Gumbo in your podcast feeds every Friday. Look us up and be sure to subscribe. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to stir your roux.